We're going to talk about a few different areas today. So initially we're going to start primarily talking around the development athlete, so the adolescent athlete, and that's really not specifically gender separate, and then we're going to go on to some work around female athletes. So one of our big issues, and it's certainly been reasonably topical in the media in the last week, so it's kind of finally come out, what we've, I guess, in the sports medicine world been arguing about over the last few years, is what's changed in sport in New Zealand, and it's not just New Zealand, it's certainly happened around the world, and what's that doing to our young athletes and the society of sport as a whole. So in the past, sport was for fun. When many of us grew up, we played a whole number of different sports. We often played a summer sport and a winter sport. Sports weren't all year round, and we did it because we loved playing with our mates and we loved a bit of competition, and clearly it was healthy and good for us, and that was really the primary driver. And we also, on top of that, had a huge amount of time for free play, right? So we might have played one or two sports, but we still had plenty of time after school to go home and play with our brothers and sisters or our mates and climb trees and do a whole host of other physical activities. And certainly these days, we see that that's changed significantly. So what we then end up with is this really different spectrum. So we end up with this large percentage of kids and adolescents who are really non-active, and then we end up with this other extreme, this group of kids who are very active, and they're really active in highly competitive environments. And I think most of us would agree that our standard, netball competition at age 11 is significantly different than it was 20 years ago, let alone our 15 to 16-year-olds playing it at a top level at school. And we have year-round sports now, so when we say year-round, we mean more than 8 months of the year, okay, so, and that's happening at younger and younger ages, and some sports, such as football, that happens more than in other sports, but certainly it's becoming an issue. And so that's when we talk about specialisation. So are we giving up other sports at the expense of this one sport, and are we doing that at younger and younger ages, and what is that doing to our athletes? Is that helping our athletes, or is that hindering our athletes? And then what's that doing to injury? So early specialisation is year-round training in one sport at the exclusion of other sports, and we know from an injury perspective there's a huge amount of research out there now telling us that this creates problems for our young athletes. So young athletes who specialise in one sport are twice as likely to suffer from a lower limb injury. And there's a few reasons for that, right? If we play a lot of sports or a number of different sports over our lifetime, particularly when we're developing as athletes, then actually we put a lot of different loads on our body, so it's kind of like changing car tyres all the time, okay? So that's a really good thing. It's a really good thing from an injury perspective, and it's also a really good thing from a skill acquisition perspective. So our kids that play multiple sports are fitter and they move better. And there's a huge amount of anecdotal research on top of other research to show us that that's the case. If we look at our elite athletes, and that's not just in New Zealand, if we look at our top NBL players, across the world, our top athletes, the majority of them played multiple sports until they got to the end of college. Okay, so once they got to sort of university age, or perhaps in our sort of year 13s, they played one sport and one sport only, and up until then they played more than one. So what do we know about performance and injuries? Well, we certainly know that except for certain sports where specialisation has to happen early, and that is sports such as gymnastics, okay, where the age of being an elite gymnast is ridiculously low in comparison to other sports, that there's actually no link between the number of training hours and playing hours and that person achieving in that sport, okay? So that's hugely important, because if we look at our sports now, how many hours per week are our kids putting into single sports, and yet that's not necessarily going to make them any better when it comes to success in those younger age groups. We're talking about adolescents here, okay? So those that play multiple sports, there's certainly a link to success. Those that are on higher level teams, so rep teams when they're older, succeed more. Those that are on rep teams when they're younger, succeed less. They are less likely to be an elite athlete, okay? So our ones that get into the reps in their year 12, for example, or year 13, they've got a reasonably good chance of doing pretty well in their sport. The ones that succeeded and got into those rep teams at 9 and 10, actually that means nothing. And so you'll see this slightly changing culture in New Zealand, and it's very slow, but it is happening, and it's happening in different sports. We're seeing it happening in football. We've seen it a month or so ago happening in North Harbour in rugby. They're pulling away rep teams, and they're doing that at the 10, 11, 12-year age group because there's nothing to show that they do anything from a positive perspective, and there's certainly a lot to say they do things from a negative perspective. It has a negative impact on the number of kids continuing to participate in sport. Kid doesn't make the Ames game team for their school, they drop out of that sport because they're clearly not good enough. Well, actually they might be great at it in 5 years' time, okay? Often in our younger age groups, kids are really, really great at a sport because actually they grow a bit quicker than their mates. They're therefore a bit faster. They're a little bit older than the kids in their class. So there's a whole host of different reasons. So to me, it's a really important point if we want to keep participation numbers in our sports up, and that's sports across the board. We do know that players that have increased weekly training and game loads are at greater risk of injury, and that's really significant. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. So player exposure time is most likely the strongest predictor of injury occurrence in our adolescent athletes. So what do we see in adolescent sport versus professional sport? Well, I've been lucky enough to work in both, and what I see is that in kids sport, we're often training and playing as many hours as our professional counterparts are, and we're doing that without much support, right? If you're in a professional environment, you've got a physio on hand, you might have a massage therapist at times, you've got good nutrition help, you've got good sports psychs, you've got all of this input that really helps them recover. And then we've got this group of kids, adolescents, developing athletes, and they don't often have any of that until they're broken, okay? And that's a growing issue. And so again, we need to be thinking about how many hours our adolescent athletes are putting into their sport, because they're doing that on a growing skeleton. And often they just don't have the capacity to cope, okay? So our bones grow first. Our muscles just get stretched. They have to keep us moving and try and keep us performing, and those areas of growth spurts are when our highest injury risks occur. Okay, it's when our kids are most uncoordinated and they're most likely to get injured. Okay. Along with that, they've got a massive amount of time in organised sport. They've got less and less and less time to spend in free play. And we've got all the research in the world telling us how important free play is. And as a physio, it's really interesting. Parents or coaches will say to us all the time, well, how come there's so many kids injured now? When we were kids, no one got injured. Well, when we were kids, we were strong. Naturally, we moved well, and we were strong because we spent a lot of time outside. We did a lot of climbing. We played a lot of games. We did a lot of jumping and hopping and skipping and all of those bits and pieces. And these days that actually doesn't happen, and our kids naturally aren't strong. Now there's exceptions to that rule, but when we talk about having to get our kids strong, that's the real difference between the two. So we're just going to touch on sleep, and I think sleep ties in with this really well, and there's a huge amount of research worldwide in professional sport that's gone into sleep over recent years, because we actually found out that it's probably one of the best ways that we can prevent injuries. We can get a reduction in about 30% in injuries, and that's contact and non-contact injuries. It's the only thing that helps prevent contact injuries. And yet, we talk about our adolescent athletes again, who are often training in the morning, training and playing at night, and then they've got schoolwork. When are they getting to sleep, and how much sleep are they getting? And we talk about our standard adult needing 7 to 8 hours a night. Our normal kids should be getting more than that. Our adult athletes, we talk about the Roger Federers of the world, the LeBron James, these guys aim for 12, 13 hours a night, right? And we're struggling. If you ask our intermediate age kids how many hours sleep they get, a huge amount of them will say less than 9, right? And that becomes an even bigger struggle when we're talking about our teenage athletes. So that has a really big role to play. So then we think, do we really need that extra training that's going to get our kids home at 8:30 at night, or actually are they better off to have had a play round after school and actually got themselves home and had a decent meal and gone to bed? So just some things to start thinking about when we're thinking about planning our structure of our team or our kids, whoever we're involved with. But certainly sleep has a huge role in reducing injury risk, and definitely performance. So, the Australian Institute of Sport, which was kind of the mecca years ago in sports medicine, came up with a guideline that was your kids, their elite junior athletes, could train and play as many hours per week as they were old, as long as they spent half their age per week in planning and preparation and recovery and everything else. So your 14-year-old athlete, they're allowed 14 hours of training and playing per week. Only if they did 7 hours of training per week, that actually helps support that. So that's not sport specific, that's not skills, that's rehab, prehab, strength, all of those other bits and pieces. We struggle to get the majority of our athletes doing 10 minutes a day, let alone 7 hours a week. And yet it's actually really easy to hit that number per week in hours of training and games if our kids play multiple sports or they play at multiple levels. So they might play school, they might play rep, they might play social or senior netball or rugby or whatever else it is as well. And so, and then we have our sports like gymnastics actually can be 11 doing 20 hours a week. So it's really, really easy to hit those numbers. And there's a massive spike in injury rates as soon as that happens. So as soon as you hit above your age in hours per week, for every additional hour you've got another 10% injury increase, okay? And that's on the week, right? So really significant. So they're not many adults. Little kids are not many adults. Teenagers aren't either, okay? Growing skeleton is a very malleable thing and it's really easy for it to get injured. And so it's a really easy guideline at least to have as a starting point to see where your athletes or your kids are at. We probably need to do less sport-specific training. We certainly need to do more strength training, but we're going to talk about that shortly, okay? So we need to become more athletic. That's very definite. So what is that, right? So that's a combination of endurance training. We need to move well. We need to get a bit stronger. We need to have some good balance. We need to jump and land well, depending on what sport we're involved in. And we need to put a demand on the body so that it actually has to adapt and change. That's how we get stronger, right? Doing some little basic exercise 10 times in a row when we could have done 30 actually just wasted a bit of time. Sport doesn't get us ready for that. It doesn't matter how much sport you play, how much training you do, it doesn't get you ready to play the sport other than give you the skills specifically for that sport. It doesn't support your body. So we know from a huge amount of research that if we get our athletes stronger and we actually make them move better, they will perform better. They'll be hugely more resilient and resistant to injuries. We can reduce their injury risk by 30 to 50%, and that's being really conservative in all honesty. There's research out there to show we can reduce it by up to 90%, okay? So we can have a massive change on injury risks. And we also know that the teams that have the least injuries win the most. It's as simple as that. And we've got data from our last Olympics showing that if our athletes completed more than 70% of their planned training throughout a year, they achieve their performance goal, okay? Are 7 times more likely to achieve their performance goal than someone who had injury after injury after injury and therefore had to adapt their training load throughout the year. So actually, injuries do have a significant effect on performance. So people ask this question all the time, what age can our kids lift weights? What age can they actually get strong? And I find it an interesting question. Years ago we used to say, oh, it would make them short. I don't know where that came from, but it'll stunt their growth so they can't lift weights when they're little. I guess my question is it's all about movement competency, right? We've got some 12-year-olds that I quite happily have lifting some weights. We've got some 25-year-olds who I wouldn't have. But so they've got to have the basic movement competency first. But after that, actually, there is no age. There's no specific age to say what is okay and what isn't. And this research, which actually only came out recently, shows us this blue line for anyone that can see it. This is athletes that started strength and conditioning pre-adolescence. And then we've got adolescents in the red, and then we've got kids that only did sport, and then we've got no strength and conditioning or sport down here. And this is how well they moved, okay, as athletes. So they maintain this. So our kids that actually learn to move well and that may be with or without load at younger age groups actually do really well, and they maintain that forever. Okay, so number one, move well. And when you recognise a kid or adolescent or athlete that doesn't move well, and unfortunately in the female realm that's pretty common, we need to try and change that. So, to summarise the development athlete space, Ideally, we don't specialise early unless we're in a sport that requires it, and there are a few sports where that certainly is the exception to the rule. We need to train athleticism, we need to make our athletes move better, and we need to make them stronger, and we need to start that younger than we currently do. Don't take away the enjoyment of sport, because actually that's what it was all about, and I think at times we need to go back to that. Parents certainly need to go back to it, but actually I think in many situations coaches do as well. And we need to learn about and at least have some basic concepts around what is appropriate load and what's inappropriate load. Okay. From a physiological perspective, we are different. And as Marion touched on before, there's many of aspects that are the same. There's also some real challenges, and there's some areas where we can really compete, and there's some areas where we'll always be separate. We need to get really comfortable talking about the menstrual cycle and the period, and in healthcare circles even that is a challenge for many people, and if we can't talk about it then it's a real issue. How's a coach going to talk about it with his or her athletes? And so that's something that we're going to talk about today. There are effects of it. There are effects of it on injury. There's certainly detrimental effects of not having it. And I think we just need to get the word out of the way and just start being comfortable with understanding it. There's a real question of how many of the effects are actually physical and how many of them are psychological. So how much do we think our period actually affects us versus how much does it actually affect us? And that's quite an interesting realm as well. If we talk about our menstrual cycle, we've probably got a picture how we'll come to it in a minute, and I'll explain how it kind of runs. There's certainly performance benefits that are possible as well, so we need to stop looking at it as just this negative thing, which is really easy to look at, particularly if you're a young female having to deal with it. But we can switch that on its head and actually get some benefits from it as well. As females, we definitely have different nutritional and recovery needs. Our period's really important, and we need to work out how we're going to deal with that, right? So how do we give our athletes the ability? How do we empower them? How do we teach them to understand how to monitor it and how to determine whether or not they have any issues with it? And then where on earth do they go for help if they do have issues with it? Because often what we see is we don't find out about it until they're an elite level athlete, and by then they've been having issues for a really long period of time. And we're really lucky in New Zealand as part of our Whisper group, which is a group of health professionals and I guess scientists from around the country working in female sport, to have done a world first. We've just surveyed our entire elite female athlete population around their menstrual cycles and the issues they've had as a result of it and their health and performance effects of it. And we've just completed that. It's going to take probably another year to get the results that come out of all of that. And no one else in the world's probably been lucky enough to have a population that we can just access from an elite perspective. So it will be really interesting to see what comes out of that. But there's some exciting stuff happening in that space, and it's nice to be able to be reasonably world leading in that space. But what we do know is there's massive issues, and there's massive issues at our elite level, so there's certainly a hell of a lot of issues at our community or development levels, and it's something that we certainly want to change. So let's talk about some physiology for a bit. So we, as girls, females, we reach our peak bone mass by the age of about 18, okay? We grow quicker and earlier than males. We usually start to develop in puberty around the age of 10, and the average age for females in New Zealand getting their period is 12, okay? Low energy availability is the most common cause of our young females not getting their period at the age they should, and we're going to have a talk about what that is and how we might recognise it and what effects that might have shortly. It certainly impacts bone density and growth. Our young athletes, let alone our young females, often eat really low amounts of protein, and it's certainly a huge issue from a nutritional perspective, and we need to be quite creative again in that adolescent space on how we ensure our kids are getting enough food, our young athletes particularly. Again, those ones that have training in the morning and training in the evening, they often don't feel like breakfast before they go to training. How are they going to fit that in? They kind of want to roll out of bed and get to training. How are they going to make sure they've got some decent food before they then go to school for the day, and how they're going to repeat that again at night, because what we most commonly see is they compete in their sport at night, or they train, they finish late, and they go home, they have their shower, and then they eat. And And we know that's too late, actually. We've lost the window of recovery from a nutritional perspective. And in a female, it's really important that's in that first 20 minutes post-exercise. And so we need to start to think about ways we can be creative to ensure we're getting adequate intake. That's good quality food or snacks to ensure our athletes are able to actually cope with the demands that are placed on them. So, we're not small men. We have more fat. We have more body fat, that is certainly the case. Most of our lean mass is in our lower body. So actually, weight for weight, we can compete against men in lower body from a lifting perspective a whole lot more than we can in our upper body, which becomes much more of a challenge. We've got a lot more endurance fibres in our muscles. So we're really good at endurance events, actually, and it's those events that are possibly less of a fight against our biology than intense efforts. We've got smaller hearts, smaller lungs, and lower oxygen carrying capacity, and that's the result of lower testosterone levels, right? So when we see in the media, and it's certainly going to continue to happen over the coming years around gender issues, and the example is the International Athletics Federation and their new ruling, that's what some of this is based on. Some of it is based on science, some of it is based on a whole lot of other stuff, but that's why it's happening, and it is certainly going to continue to evolve, that space, and that is well out of my realm, but that's why it occurs. So we're really good fat burners during exercise as females. We're really rubbish at fat burning after exercise, so that's really unfair, many will say. So we can go and do the same exercise as males. We'll burn fat for 3 hours after that exercise. They'll burn it for 21 hours. So when you say, it's really unfair, why does my husband lose weight really easily and I don't? It's biology, right? Sucks, but it is the way that it is. We need to be aware of. We struggle to access our carbohydrates at higher intensities, and that just sometimes creates issues when we're talking about short, hard bursts of training, particularly at a certain stage of our menstrual cycle. We sweat later and we sweat less, and we're really poor at regulating heat in comparison to males. And again, that varies over the menstrual cycle, so we'll touch on that. But males are much better at adapting to heat. So if we're in a sport where we are competing in hot environments, or we're travelling to areas where we're going to compete in the heat, that's harder for females. We take longer to adapt to it. Because we sweat less and we sweat later, we get hotter and hotter. The last week before we get our period, we're already hotter. Our core temperature's already high, and we struggle to offload it. So we might finish exercise, go have a shower. Guy goes and has a shower, he's cooled down. We're still like, why am I hotter than I was before the shower, right? That's why that happens, okay? So you're not going crazy, that's just physiology, that's just the way that it is. And we can't necessarily change it, but we can certainly be aware of it, and we can put strategies in place, pre-cooling strategies, slushies before we compete, things like that, to help our girls adapt to that if we're involved in sports where heat is an issue. So this is our menstrual cycle. We're just going to look at this little, day one we get our period, we are most like a guy. That seems really weird, but it is the case. That's when our estrogen and progesterone are rock bottom. We have our highest level of testosterone, and yet our female athletes often think they're going to perform like rubbish because they've got their period, right? The number of years and tournaments I've been to, girls skipping their periods, doing whatever they can to not get their period, because that would have been the worst thing in the world to have had that when they competed. Actually, from a physiological perspective, for the majority of people, that's a performance advantage, right? That skips the small percentage of people that get the crappy stomachs and the headaches and migraines. You know, there is a group of people that sit here, right? But for the majority of athletes, actually, it's when we can potentially be at our best. I'm not saying it's not a pain, because there's the hassle side of it, but from a performance perspective, it's good, okay? As we go through our menstrual cycle, we split it into weeks, right? So it's 4 weeks, and at the start these levels are really low, and then we get an increase in estrogen, and then after we're halfway through our period, our progesterone comes up, and in the last week we've got a whole lot of hormones going on, right? So if we're going to bank a week that is really probably going to be reasonably average, if any of them are going to be, it's going to be the week just before you get your period. It's not when you've actually got your period, okay? And I guess my big thing with that is I'd rather we focused on the positive effects when we're talking to our athletes than the negative effects they may get, because many of them won't get them other than perceiving they may get them. But it's really important that we understand the difference. So, progesterone and estrogen, they're our two reproductive hormones. They're essential for our, the difference that makes our biology separate from males. So, progesterone increases our protein catabolism. So again, we break down protein, we break down muscle. We're less good at absorbing protein. And that's the entire way through, and that worsens even more, unfortunately, as females when we get around menopause. But our young females, this is really important, right? So we talk about them not getting in enough protein probably in normal life, and then we take them through to the last week before their period where their progesterone levels are really high, and they break down muscle. Right? So if we don't feed that muscle, if we don't allow it to recover after performance, then all that training they just did is kind of in vain from a physical perspective, right? Because they will break down muscle to recover. Okay, so that 20-minute window to me is really, really essential. So what are we giving our young athletes to ensure that they haven't just trained really hard and gone home and actually ended up possibly worse off than they were before they trained, okay? It increases our respiratory rate, so we can struggle a little bit more in that last week. And often the thing that I find with this is just being aware of that. If we're fitness testing our athletes, for example, and we do it maybe on a regular basis, or we compare our results to what they used to be like, or we're comparing results within the team, then actually there is actually some biology to suggest that actually she might have a harder week, so she might have a really crappy result. And now that might make a little bit of sense. It's not that she didn't try really hard, it's not that she hasn't been training really well. So again, it takes those little specific points in time and says, okay, there's some external influences on this. So not that we ignore the result necessarily, but is there some other reasons why this has occurred, particularly if the result was out of the ordinary or something that wasn't expected. So we talked about how we struggle with heat, and certainly when our progesterone is high, we do really struggle with it, okay? We are hotter in that last week before we get our period, as our baseline core temperature is elevated already, and then we've got more progesterone, so we really struggle to shift that heat. So estrogen causes us to hold fluid. So when we feel like, God, I'm bloated, or my legs are heavy, and God, why do my legs look bigger than they looked 2 weeks ago, and actually there's no difference to me whatsoever, that's why that happens, okay? And we can struggle at intensity sometimes, but we do certainly have a good capacity for burning fat during exercise. So we're going to talk about some of the side effects, and this is a small subset of the population, and clearly it's a very much a sliding scale, and there's some people who really struggle with severe effects, and some that struggle, I guess along the scale. So cramping and gastrointestinal issues are common. They're common in females, and I think what I found most interesting in elite sport is we've got our top professional athletes, and they actually don't have any idea on how to manage this, right? And they've gotten as far as they've gotten without any change. So we really need to help those people, or identify those people at younger ages. So if we see our girls struggling with that, then actually, do they know about it? And do they know how they can get some help around that and trial some strategies that actually will help, okay? So cramping and gastrointestinal issues happen because prostaglandins make the uterus contract, right? So basically the idea is to minimise prostaglandin production. So it usually happens in and around that period time, and we can try and change it by planning in the run up to it. So magnesium and fish oils and low dose aspirin are all taken to reduce prostaglandin production, and therefore resolve or prevent us getting stomach cramps, okay? And there's obviously things on the market that you can use when they actually occur, like Ponstan and things like that, but some girls, this really affects performance, right? So it's something that we need to be aware of. Headaches and menstrual migraines can certainly be a huge issue for many people, and that happens when our estrogen levels drop. So we're trying to sort of dull that drop a little bit. And so the aim is to eat nitric oxide rich foods. Okay, so primarily our red foods, there's others, but if we think of our beetroots, our pomegranate, watermelon, spinach, there's a whole realm of different foods that we can eat in the run-up to that happening, and so they help prevent that shift being really severe. Okay, so again, if we've got someone who does really struggle with that, we need to acknowledge it and we need to send them to someone who understands it, who will help them. And we're pretty lucky in this region, to be honest, in comparison to a lot of regions. We've now got, I guess, a growing network in the high performance sport realm who work with community athletes as well as professional athletes. Rupture an ACL, our knee ages 30 years, okay? So this is what we want to prevent, and in New Zealand this is becoming a growing issue. So less than 10 years ago, we had less than 5 ACLs a year in our young age group, right? And I'm talking under 12-year-olds. Last year we had 69. So that's massive increase in 10 years. Right, and probably the most significant injury from a sporting perspective, as well as an overall health perspective, long term, right? So that's huge, and it's a growing problem. And so when you see things from ACC, and there's many things from ACC that I don't necessarily agree with, but when they're out there in the media and they're going on and on about some of the stuff, this is why, right? We've actually got some really hard stats to show that this is the highest growing age group of injuries in New Zealand, right? As in the 10 to 18 year age group, and actually 10 to 14 is the biggest. Okay, so we're reducing injuries successfully a little bit in the older age groups, and yet it's growing exponentially in these younger age groups. And it has really significant effects. Drop out of sport levels, up to 50% never return to sport after an ACL. A reasonable percentage of those that do return will never return to the same level. And our long-term health of our knee is not great, right? And the worst thing is, probably up to 70% of them are preventable. So that's the biggest issue.
Sorry, just was that boys and girls or just girls when you were talking?
This data here is boys and girls, the ACC data. Yeah, unfortunately we can't extrapolate that. It would be nice if we could separate that out. And this is just registered ACC claims, right? So there'll be a huge number of young kids out there, potentially in comparison to this number, have hurt their knee and that's never been picked up, right? Because actually, even a couple of years ago, if I'd seen a 10-year-old come in with a knee injury, you would never have considered that they would have ruptured their ACL. But say Ames Games netball last year, we had 3, right? They're happening more and more frequently. We get more shoulder injuries, and that's probably related to the fact that we're just not as strong in the upper body in comparison to males. Some of it, personally, I think, is because when we're playing contact sports, actually we just don't have the same history of it. Right, so our technique's probably not quite as good. We haven't had that sort of broken down. We didn't necessarily play. A lot of our girls who are playing elite level rugby now didn't play when they were 5 or 6 like our young boys did. Now that's starting to change, and so it'll be really interesting to see how that changes over the coming years. We get more knee pain as girls. We get way more stress fractures, okay, and it's related to this low energy availability that we'll talk about. And we get higher concussion rates. Now the question with this is, do we get more concussion? Do we get more chronic complex concussion? Or as females, do we just introspectively look at absolutely everything when we get a concussion and therefore feed all that information back, whereas the male just gets concussed, kind of deals with it, and for the majority of them get on with it? That's probably unsure at the moment, but there certainly is a question mark around that, okay? So what does the research tell us about preventing some of these injuries? And certainly in the ACL space, we've got a massive amount of research worldwide, hugely funded, good research, and we know that we can reduce them by a huge amount. We know that we can reduce all major injuries by 50% if we do a decent warm-up. We know we can prevent all injuries, mild or moderate, by 30%. Ideally, we start this pre-puberty, so this is where things need to change, right? We might see our first 15s and our senior A netball teams doing some decent warm-ups, but actually when you go to field on a Saturday or to the netball courts, what do we see most of our 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old girls and boys doing? Actually going for a run and doing a stretch, which is, what we did, and it's just not great. And so to me that's the biggest opportunity in sport, and certainly the biggest opportunity in female sport, in order for us to get some change. And when we talk about our adolescent athletes, once we hit puberty, so until puberty, boys and girls are the same physiologically, injury rates, everything's the same. Once we hit puberty, that's when it all goes a little bit awry, and that's because males get this big strength increase and we don't, right? So we stay down here, and so we keep putting demands on, but we don't necessarily have the support for our bodies that our young males do. So this stuff becomes even more important to me. So this is just some of the work coming out from our ACL group, from our Whisper group, and again, so up to 50% of athletes don't return to sport, the same level of sport after an ACL rupture. Up to 90% of them can be prevented. That's a normal warm-up program before your sport, right? 10 to 20 minutes. It's got to involve a whole lot of different stuff, some strength, some balance, some change of direction, some jumping and landing if that's part of your sport. That's it, right? Not rocket science. ACC Sport Smart have some reasonable resources online if you've got no idea of where to start, and then you just adapt it to your sport, right? But hugely effective, and yet unfortunately still probably not being done anywhere near enough, okay? So we're going to switch tact a little bit, and we're going to talk around menstrual cycle disturbances, because it's probably a growing realm of what we are starting to see in New Zealand, and it's certainly something we want to change. So amenorrhea is when you don't get your period, and so there's two different groups there. There's a group that never got their period, and there's a group that got their period and then it's disappeared. Okay, so two separate bunches. And oligomenorrhea just means they've got a disturbance of their menstrual cycle, so it's just not regular, okay? So as we talked about before, average age about 13 in New Zealand, might take up to a couple of years to get regular after that. And if they're not showing some signs of it by 13, 14 years of age, and they're an athlete involved in a lot of sport, then I'd be questioning where we're at, right? And that would be a person that I'd want to have assessed from a hormone level perspective. So the easiest way to cause us to lose our period or not get our period is for us to have a thing called low energy availability, which is LEA, which is effectively not enough coming in versus the amount that we're expending, right? So we can simplify it down as much as that. The thing about it is, it's not necessarily our skinny little girls or our little athletes. Clearly in some sports, there's higher rates of that, and sports like gymnastics and stuff are certainly one of the great areas of issue. But you don't have to be little, you don't have to be skinny, you can be any size. It just means that you haven't got enough energy in for how much you're using, and so you're in negative energy balance, okay? And it only takes a couple of kgs in order to put you into that, right? And that's enough to make you lose your period, okay? When we lose our period, it only takes a couple of menstrual cycles to be missed. Effect on our bone health, okay? So we're going to reach peak bone mass by 18, and if we are 15 and we haven't got our period yet, or we were 13 and we got it and we've lost it, we haven't had it for however long, then our chance of getting to peak bone mass is reduced, right? So they've done studies, identical twin sisters, one was an athlete who did high level sports, was in low energy availability, one who didn't. This one is ridiculously taller than this one. It affects how high we grow, how tall we grow, and it affects then how dense those bones become. So this week I saw a 33-year-old with the bone density of an osteoporotic woman, and that's a problem, right? It's a massive problem, and it's a problem she can do nothing about now, right? She can try and maintain what she's got, but she's missed the window of opportunity in life to grow. And so when you hear athletes, or your child or whoever it may be, and they've missed their period a few times, or they haven't had it for a couple of years, and we had a case last year away with a New Zealand team, same thing, I haven't had my period for 4 or 5 months, changed my diet, became vegan. Nothing against being vegan, but if you're an athlete, you've got to be really careful if you're going to use an alternative diet to ensure that you're actually getting the appropriate amount of nutritional requirements. And there is actually a condition called orthorexia now. It's an obsession with healthy eating. We see it more and more. Clean eating would be another term for it. That stuff's all well and great, but actually athletes are not general population, right? They don't diet and exercise, they've got to eat and train, and so we have to fuel their bodies to do that, and if we don't, there's some hugely negative impacts that can happen. So what do we look out for? Actually, there's some really cognitive issues with amenorrhea, or us not getting our menstrual cycles. And so these are the kids who start struggling in school. They lack concentration, they're kind of in a fog, a bit dazed all the time, and when you talk to female athletes who have suffered from this, they'll all talk about this cognitive effect that it had on them, like they're in a little bit of a cloud. They get a reduction in skill acquisition and training, so all of a sudden they're just not quite as good as they were. They just can't do things quite as well, and there's certainly a huge impact on performance. So I guess my main message out of this is losing your period for even a month, it's not normal, okay? And we need to be flagging those girls at a younger age and working out how we can help them. And sometimes that helps just education. Sometimes they actually just need to be told about it and what effects it have, and then all of a sudden they're fine. Many, when it's been deep-seated or it's been there for a long period of time, will obviously take a lot more, but we need to be looking into it, not just pretending that it doesn't happen. So it's really hard for a girl to get her period if she's under 50 kgs, okay? They say 50 to 55, you can get it, but it's a challenge in comparison, and that's just because of your hormone secretion, okay? That helps you get your period. When we have people in this realm with low energy availability, trying to get them out of that can be a real struggle, right? So if you haven't had your period for 3 months, you should certainly see a sports doc who's experienced in female health, and we're lucky here, we've got Judith May at Grace Hospital. You might have a great GP, you might be lucky, but most GPs don't work in this space, right? So asking them what to do is actually a pretty big challenge. It's a pretty tall order if you want to get the right results, so go and see someone who actually knows about it. Because then they can put you onto a network of people that will help you deal with it, right? And that's, whether that's a nutritionist or it's sports psych or whoever else needs to be involved, they can make sure you've actually got the support around that, okay? Some of our big athletes really struggle with this because they're taller, they've got big lean muscle mass, actually they require more energy. And so it's actually easier for them to fall into this realm than it often is our young, tiny little gymnast, okay? We also, an interesting point I think, and it's not necessarily just for our young athletes, but you actually don't lose weight if you starve your body, right? The female body is built to conserve fat if we stop eating or if we don't get enough energy, and that's because basically there's 5 body systems and there's only 2 of them that aren't essential to survival, and that's bone health and the reproductive system, okay? And so we need to keep that going, and if that's not going to go, we lose our bone density and we lose our menstrual cycle, and then we put our body in the stress state, and so our body says, oh, hold, we don't want to be in famine, we don't want to, we need to survive, we need to keep reproducing, we need to produce these hormones, and so it holds on to our body fat because they help produce our reproductive hormones, okay? So often people wonder, and they tend to be older females, but they don't lose weight, and that's a very large part of it. So actually you kind of need to stimulate your body to lose weight, right, rather than the other way around. So if we lose our menstrual cycle, there's very definitely effects on speed. So when we talk about strength training in females, and there's a whole lot of different opinions on this, right? So I think it's a huge area of opportunity. I think our young females haven't historically worked in strength training programs like our young males have. Certainly from a school perspective, S&C programs have been in most guys' schools for a long period of time now, and are slowly starting to come into some of our female schools, which is great, and it certainly needs to happen. There's certainly a very large variation in quality in those programs that we probably need to be a little bit aware of. But it's a good thing that it's happening. Some females don't want to get big, they don't want to get muscly, right? That's an issue for some females, and what I will tell you is that unless you are lifting heavy weights as a female and you're lifting them all the time, and I'm talking heavy weights, you're just not going to get there, right? You just don't grow big muscle mass because we don't have the testosterone in order to do it. The Portia Woodmans, the Lisa Carringtons are the exceptions to the rule because of what they lift and how they train. Looked at altering their female athletes' training programs according to their menstrual cycle. Now, if we're in teams, that at times is a challenge. If we're not in teams, that's a whole lot easier. But even in teams, when we've got athletes who have various parts of their training programs that are individualised, so the gym programs might be their own, then we can actually modify that according to where they are in their cycle in order to ensure they get the best results. And if we do that, basically what we do is we split the menstrual cycle into 4 weeks. So we get our period here. So for the first week when we've got our period, we start lifting. So we start lifting some good weight, and we really build on it in week 2, and we lift as heavy as is sensible for us. And but we train hard, right? Those middle 2 weeks, and when we're going to do really pretty well from a training perspective. And that last week, we start recovering, right? So that we're ready to go again. And if we look at periodising a training month, then actually that starts to make a little bit of sense, okay? And so we can start looking at ensuring that by here, we're ready to repeat the whole thing again, okay? Rather than thinking that 4 weeks out of 4 are going to be exactly the same, okay? And every sport and every athlete is going to have a different way of whether or not they can look at that sort of a program or not. It's just something to be aware of. Right, so finally, just to touch on nutrition. So we talked about protein before. We certainly struggle to achieve calcium and iron requirements needed as well. And that's, again, normal female population, let alone athletes that are performing a huge amount of sport. Okay? Someone that gets a really heavy period, they're way more likely to be iron deficient. So if you've got someone who really struggles with that, they suffer some of the menstrual cycle issues, and yet they're someone who's fatigued at training, just sort of seems to have kind of lost their spark. They don't have the normal energy levels that you would expect, then iron deficiency is something that potentially can rear its head, and that can cause some big issues, and so it's something to be aware of, okay? And importance of protein consumption within 20 minutes post-training, we talked about before, but just making sure they're getting some adequate food into them, okay? So, Clue and Fitter, these are online resources. They are apps. They are apps that allow our female athletes or anyone to monitor their period. They give some information around some of the effects of their period and some advice around bits and pieces. Up to you which one you like. Fitter comes from the UK. It is a really great app, probably focuses a bit more on the negatives than the positives, which is possibly more of the advantage of Clue. But if you're working with female athletes, it's a really easy way, without having to have regular discussions with them, which clearly potentially isn't going to happen, around their menstrual cycle, of saying, righto, this is something I want you to kind of take charge of, okay? Give them some ownership of it, educate their parents about it, and if they've got issues, then at least they start to track them, and then they can take that information to someone who can actually help them, okay? Fuel Aotearoa is a really good resource around low energy availability, and gives some really good resources off there as well, okay? And any comments, feel free to put me an email. These are just some of our group that work with Whisper, who are involved largely in this space, and we're pretty lucky, right? World leading really in New Zealand, so I think some pretty cool stuff will come out of this over the coming years for anyone working in this space.